Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who demands access to my garage. It was early spring, bright sunshine illuminating our neat suburban street as I rolled the trash bins out to the curb. I had just moved into this neighborhood not too long ago. Maybe it had been a few months, definitely less than a year. I was excited to settle into what I thought would be a peaceful environment surrounded by tidy lawns, trimmed hedges, and friendly folks who waved hello on their way to work. In this quiet setting, the last thing I expected was an all-out feud over something as basic as a garage. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be dealing with a neighbor pushing the limits of entitlement, I would have shaken my head in disbelief. But I had no idea what was coming. My first real conversation with Karen wasn't even about the garage. Actually, it all began when she stopped me to gripe about how my hedges might be too close to the property line. I did my due diligence, measured everything, and confirmed that my hedges were well within my property. When I pointed that out, she seemed miffed and muttered something along the lines of, "Well, this isn't how we do things here. Neighbors are supposed to help neighbors." I shrugged it off as a minor misunderstanding and moved on with my day, not realizing that Karen had a pattern of imposing her own rules on people around here. Looking back, that was my first glimpse of her sense of superiority. At the time, I didn't pay it much heed, thinking we'd either resolve it quietly or simply remain distant neighbors who waved but didn't chat much. Her second gripe came a few weeks later when I was installing a new fence in my backyard. I hired a local contractor for this job, partly because I'm not a big DIY expert when it comes to fencing, and partly because I wanted it done quickly and professionally. Karen walked over to me during the installation, while the contractor was actively working, and started going on about how the wood color might clash with the rest of the houses on the block. I noticed the workers had paused because her interruption was blocking their path to grab tools. Politely, I ushered her aside and told her I'd do my best to keep everything looking tidy and consistent. That was the second time I spotted that hint of dissatisfaction in her eyes, like I was still not following some unwritten rule that only she knew. You might be asking why I didn't just ignore her. Well, in a neighborhood like ours, it's often easier to keep the peace by trying to meet people halfway. However, Karen rarely displayed any sign of meeting me or anyone else halfway. My neighbors, like a lovely couple across the street, had quietly warned me about Karen's history of meddling. They said she had tried to dictate how tall their lawn ornaments should be, insisted she had the right to prune their trees for aesthetic reasons, and once confronted them about not sorting their recycling properly. This was years before I moved in, so she'd already established a reputation for stepping beyond social boundaries. I didn't know that Karen's greatest audacity was still ahead of me. It would center on her second car, a brand new, glistening vehicle that she apparently had nowhere to store. Karen owned a 2-car garage, as did most of the folks on the street, but the rumor was that she left her first car right in the middle, storing random boxes, old furniture, and other clutter around it. In other words, her second car wouldn't fit, at least not without her doing some serious organizing. From an outside perspective, the solution seemed obvious: clean up or rearrange your garage. But that wasn't how Karen operated. She preferred pushing her inconvenience onto other people's shoulders. One bright Monday, I was coming back from a quick grocery run. Karen stood on her driveway with her arms folded, fixating on me as I unloaded my trunk. Despite my best attempt at a friendly wave, she marched straight over. I should have known from the look on her face that she had something big to ask. After clearing her throat dramatically, she said, "I need to use your garage." No greeting, no preamble, just that. Stunned, I stood there, uncertain of how to respond. So I asked, "What do you mean you need to use my garage?" She rolled her eyes as if I were being deliberately obtuse, and explained that her second car was scheduled to be delivered the following weekend, and because her first car was already occupying her garage, she had nowhere else to put this new one. Normally, if a neighbor politely requested temporary parking for a day while they reorganized or cleaned up, I'd consider it, but in this case, it was obvious she meant indefinitely. She didn't give any indication that she'd only need it for a short time. She simply wanted an extra indoor space, presumably so she wouldn't have to do the work of clearing out her own garage. I was floored, to say the least. When I politely declined, she stared at me as if I'd insulted her. She countered my refusal with a string of complaints and even some bizarre pseudo-legal references, claiming that I was obligated to help a neighbor. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or walk away, so I calmly told her that I wasn't comfortable with someone else's car in my garage, that it was private property, and that I liked using it for my own projects. Looking back, I see that was the exact point where she decided to escalate. She didn't like hearing the word no. She believed she had certain entitlements, ones that extended well beyond reason. Karen tried to press me by citing some random ordinance she claimed existed, something about community cooperation in emergency situations. But her second car did not strike me as an emergency. The more she talked, the more I realized she was patching together unrelated bits of local regulations, presumably hoping I was too new to the area to know the real rules. When I told her I'd done my research before moving in and knew my rights, she stormed off in a huff, threatening that she'd do something to set things right. I didn't know what she meant by that, and to be frank, I wasn't too anxious about it. I thought, what can she really do? That question was answered the following Saturday. Early in the morning, I heard loud banging on my front door. By the time I went downstairs, I realized it was a police officer. Let me tell you, seeing law enforcement at your doorstep at 7 in the morning is quite the jolt, especially when you have no clue what's going on. When I answered, the officer explained that Karen had called the station. She told them she was locked out of a shared garage, implying that she had some kind of legal right to access my property. My jaw practically hit the floor. Not only was that completely false, but her wording made it sound like I was forcibly preventing her from accessing her own belongings or something along those lines. I took a deep breath and invited the officer to step inside so I could calmly recount the entire story. He listened patiently, looking more and more perplexed at Karen's claims. Thankfully, I had documentation for my property boundaries and rights. I'd even retained a copy of my purchase agreement that made it abundantly clear that the garage was my sole property, with no shared interest. After a few minutes, the officer seemed convinced that Karen's story was baseless. Then he asked me to accompany him outside, where Karen was waiting on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and her face set in a determined scowl. The officer turned to her and said, "Ma'am, this property belongs to the gentleman here. He has full rights to his garage." She exploded, rattling off a range of accusations that included everything from me stealing her rightful space to non-compliance with local directives. The officer tried to settle her down, but she wouldn't listen. She demanded he force me to give her access to my garage under some sort of code, but the officer kept repeating that there was no legal requirement to do so. It was the strangest and most surreal standoff I'd experienced. The rest of our neighbors started peeking out their windows, probably wondering why Karen was yelling at a police officer, waving her hands in the air as if she were orchestrating a frantic choir. Eventually, the officer warned Karen that if she didn't stop harassing me, she might be facing a citation for misuse of emergency services and for making a false police report. That was all it took for her to turn her wrath on him. She claimed he was not doing his job properly by refusing to make me comply with her demands. After an exasperated sigh, the officer told her that calling 911, or the non-emergency line under false pretenses, was a serious matter, and she'd better think very carefully about how she proceeded. Karen's face turned from red to purple. Then, she shifted tactics to something truly out of left field. "What am I worse than my son? He gets to park his car in my garage when he visits me, so I should be allowed to put my other car in someone else's garage if I want to." I couldn't even process that logic. The officer looked at me with an expression that said, "I'm sorry you're dealing with this." Karen demanded my phone number, again, and insisted I give her the code to my automatic garage door opener. At that point, my exasperation turned to indignation. I told her I wasn't giving her anything. Not now, not ever. She huffed, turned on her heel, and stomped back to her house. The officer shook his head, apologized for the disturbance, and walked away. I assumed that was the end of it. Maybe Karen had made a fool of herself so thoroughly that she'd just retreat and fume privately. Boy, was I wrong. 2 days later, I got a letter from the local municipality's Department of Public Safety. Apparently, Karen had filed an official complaint stating that I was violating some local code by preventing her from using shared resources. I nearly choked on my coffee reading it. The letter was more of a formality, indicating that they had received a complaint and were investigating. I called the number on the letter, explained my side, and the official who picked up actually laughed in disbelief. He assured me the letter was just a standard notice they send to all parties, that in all likelihood the claim would be dismissed once they completed an initial review. Still, it was unsettling to see how far Karen was willing to go. Around the same time, Karen started distributing what looked like flyers around the neighborhood. One landed on my porch. In it, she wrote a lengthy diatribe about how certain neighbors were selfish and refused to uphold the community spirit, referencing me indirectly by describing the blue house next door and insinuating I was hoarding resources that should be communal. Most neighbors either tossed her flyer in the trash or read it purely for entertainment. I found out from the friendly couple across the street that Karen had been ranting about me to them. They told me she even threatened to take me to small claims court. Although I was frustrated, I tried to keep my cool. If she did go that route, I was confident any judge would dismiss her case instantly. In the weeks that followed, Karen's new car was delivered, and she began parking it on the street, right in front of my house. That alone wasn't a huge deal. Street parking was allowed on our side, though it did feel a bit petty. However, what escalated matters was that Karen started leaving it there for days on end, ignoring the municipality's rule that street-parked cars needed to be moved every 48 hours to allow for cleaning, plowing, or just general curb rotation. She was clearly using it as a passive-aggressive way to pressure me. The local parking enforcement officer eventually placed a warning on her windshield, which only fueled her anger. She knocked on my door one evening and insisted, "If you would just let me use your garage, I wouldn't have to leave my car outside for the city to ticket." I politely pointed out that she had a 2-car garage, which was her responsibility to clear out. Of course, that fell on deaf ears. Karen then tried another tactic. She started filing noise complaints against me whenever I so much as revved my engine in the morning. I was working a job that sometimes required me to leave early, around 6 a.m., and she complained that starting my car that early was disturbing the peace. The local officials came by once, listened to my perfectly normal engine idle, and rolled their eyes. They explained that quiet hours ended at 7 a.m. in our town, but that the level of noise my car produced was barely above a hushed conversation. They apologized for bothering me and left. That's when I realized Karen had gone from entitled to vindictive. She was trying to bury me under complaints, hoping something would stick. Amid this chaos, I discovered another subplot brewing. Karen was behind on her homeowners association dues. I stumbled across this tidbit when I attended my first HOA meeting. While I'm not a huge fan of endless community rules, I do believe in meeting obligations once you choose to live in such a neighborhood. During the meeting, the HOA treasurer mentioned that some residents were in arrears on their payments. She didn't name names, but she did mention that if these dues weren't paid, a lien could be placed on the property. I suspected Karen might be one of the delinquent parties, especially given the tension I'd seen in her whenever the HOA was brought up. Coincidentally, Karen had also been complaining to the HOA about me, alleging that I was refusing to cooperate with a neighbor's parking emergency. When the HOA president asked me about it in a private conversation, I explained the entire scenario. He listened carefully, scratched his head, and admitted he hadn't heard anything like this in all his years. "I'll look into it," he said, trying to stay neutral. But it was evident he found it bizarre. Not surprisingly, the next HOA newsletter reiterated that homeowners must use their garage spaces for their own vehicles and keep the street clear when possible, unless there was a short-term visitor. In other words, the HOA essentially directed the same instruction to Karen that I had given her. If you need more space, clear your garage. This only riled Karen up more. She posted a rant on the community bulletin board at the local supermarket, stating that the HOA was conspiring with me to harass her. She also claimed that I was discriminating against her in some vague sense, though she never specified how. One of my other neighbors took a photo of the ranting note and sent it to me. It didn't bother me as much as it made me realize she was truly committed to her false narrative. One day, Karen made her biggest mistake. I jogged around the neighborhood early one morning. When I returned, I saw 2 police cars in front of my house and Karen pacing the driveway. Curious about her latest idea, my heart sank. One officer recognized me from the previous incident when I approached. He waved and asked me to explain. Karen shouted again about needing my garage, how I was holding her property hostage, and how she was going to teach me a lesson. I asked the officer calmly what happened. He said Karen said I stole her car keys, which was insane. She never showed me her keys. She tried to get into my garage while I was out, realized it was locked, and then raged and told the police I took her keys so she couldn't drive. I was shocked when the officer told me Karen tried to open my garage door with a crowbar. The officer photographed the scratch marks. The second officer was quietly talking to Karen, but she kept pointing at me and shouting that I was at fault. I explained that I was jogging, had never had her car keys, and she had no right to enter my garage. The officer nodded and requested my ID and possibly a copy of my property deed or other proof of ownership. Since I was used to this routine, I kept a copy of my deed in my desk. I brought him inside, gave him the document, and he skimmed it to confirm my ownership. The second officer said he needed to verify Karen's story when we returned outside. Her tale kept changing. She said she lost her keys in my garage. She claimed she never had them. I must have hidden them, she said. A strange performance. Officer's face showed he didn't believe it. Karen ended up in trouble. An officer asked if I wanted to press charges for attempted break-in or property damage. I needed time to think. He said I'd have a strong case because my garage door had fresh pry marks and multiple witnesses to her behavior. Karen heard and pleaded with the officer. I can't get arrested over this. Just a misunderstanding. However, the officer explained that forcibly entering someone else's property was no misunderstanding. I declined to press charges that day, but I requested a police report in case I changed my mind. Karen was warned, and the officers documented everything. I showed my attorney friend the photos at dinner that night. He advised me to get a restraining order if she continued. He said, "You deserve to feel safe in your own home, free from harassment." A week later, another neighbor informed me that Karen had been cited and fined by the city. It appears the police documented her false statements, misuse of law enforcement resources, and attempted property damage. In addition, she was fined for repeatedly parking her car on the street after the allotted time. The neighborhood believed she owed more than a small fine. Her recent transgressions were adding up. That's not including the consequences of her HOA dues non-payment. I was relieved to see accountability, but I didn't like her fines. I wish she would pause and realize her outrageous behavior. Karen stopped talking on the radio. We never saw her outside, and her second car was in her driveway, not on the street or in my space. She even towed some of her clutter to make room in her garage. Other neighbors said she stopped talking about me in her daily gossip sessions and focused on how unfair the city treated her. I imagine fines woke people up. Finally, I sighed with relief. The tension seemed to ease. One more surprise. A month later, the HOA met again and informed me that Karen's property was lined for unpaid dues. If not settled soon, the HOA would sue to recover those payments. She must have known because she attended that meeting in person. Everyone was nervous about an explosive confrontation, but Karen sat quietly in the back, occasionally glaring at me. Near the end, she raised her hand and ranted about how the HOA never helped her in her time of need, referencing her second car incident. The HOA president calmly reiterated that no one could park in another's garage without permission. Karen then attacked me as one of those newbies who didn't respect the older residents, saying the HOA should have forced me to comply. She received no sympathy from the group. Several people called her demands ridiculous. Karen left the meeting furious. Since then, Karen and I have had little contact, which is fine. Ironically, the incident made street people friendlier to me. They probably understood that I defended my property rights and stayed calm despite Karen's extreme behavior. Sometimes a neighbor would stop by to chat and shake their head over that weird garage fiasco. They'd also tell stories of how Karen had meddled in their affairs in the past, but none had experienced the escalation I had. One neighbor joked that Karen found her match, someone who wouldn't give in to her demands or be intimidated by her lies. That was kind, but I felt sorry for her. Her neighbors would likely help her in legitimate situations if she approached them with kindness or reason. One subplot of this mess was my decision to upgrade my home security system. I initially wanted perimeter cameras to deter trespassing. I realized that cameras are impartial witnesses in modern times. I would have video evidence to defend myself if Karen or anyone else lied. I bought a motion detection cloud-backed system. Installing the cameras was difficult because I wanted to cover my property lines and garage entrance without invading neighbors' privacy. Professional installers completed the setup over a weekend. I'm not paranoid, but the fiasco made me more cautious. Another subplot involves the friendly couple across the street who warned me about Karen. They and I are closer, inviting each other to barbecues and small gatherings. We co-organized a block-wide yard sale where anyone could join. The event was a success, but Karen didn't participate, though she could have sold some garage clutter. She was absent, but the neighborhood enjoyed old collectibles, conversation, and grilled hot dogs. A few whispered that they were glad Karen hadn't come to fight over table arrangements or prices. It was clear that relief was present. It would be a lie to say Karen's tension disappeared. She sometimes stares coldly at me as I drive by. However, she no longer demands from me. The last rumor was that she was renting a friend's garage a few blocks away for her second car. That arrangement, if it exists, seems friendlier than her attempt to force me to use mine. For their part, the police have found her claims absurd. The officer recognized me when we met at a coffee shop. He inquired about my garage. After I said it was peaceful, he half-jokingly said, "Let's hope we never have to come back to that address for something like that again." After the dust settled, I reflected on the whole situation. I wondered what makes someone act so irrationally over a car space. Was she too proud to organize her garage? Maybe she hated me from the start and used any excuse to bother me. Hard to say. Controlling people sometimes target the nearest vulnerable target. She may have thought I was naive about my rights or intimidated enough to comply because I was new. When that failed, she escalated, and in any case, I was comforted by measured justice. I never had to retaliate or degrade her. Standing my ground, presenting evidence, and letting official channels resolve her ridiculous claims was enough. The city fined her. The HOA held her accountable for her dues, and police warned her. All those steps reminded me that, despite the chaos, systems can protect homeowners from such intrusion. Personal experience taught me the value of documentation. I recorded the date, event, and photos whenever Karen tried something new. That helped me keep a timeline and likely made the authorities take my side more seriously. I would advise anyone in a similar situation to keep records. Avoid relying on memory, especially when dealing with liars. The situation is mostly resolved months later. My garage stays mine. I do my hobbies, carpentry, automotive tinkering, and seasonal storage, in there without worrying about someone breaking in. Now the neighborhood has that calm vibe I liked. If I see Karen far away, I nod politely. I'm fine with her not nodding. I don't need her friendship or approval. I want quiet home enjoyment. Interestingly, some neighbors think she'll leave. She may be too frustrated with everyone who's taken my side, which is the neighborhood. I doubt it. But if she sold her house and left, I wouldn't be surprised. But for now, I'll keep living my life and interacting positively with neighbors who respect boundaries. I never expected boundary protection to be such a big theme in suburban life, but it shows that even in quiet communities, rules can cause drama if someone breaks them. Ultimately, this experience taught the importance of speaking up while remaining calm. Karen tried to take over my garage, which was confusing and intrusive, but if I had given in, she might have kept going. I demonstrate that I won't be bullied or tricked into compliance by being firm. This was a principle issue, not just the garage. It was about protecting my homeowner rights from someone else's preferences. Overall, it reminds us to stand firm when someone tries to exploit our good nature. One last note. I contacted my insurance company after Karen tried to pry open my garage door. They asked if I wanted to claim property damage. Although noticeable, the crowbar marks did not affect garage door functionality. My insurance agent said Karen would likely have to pay for repairs regardless of litigation. It wasn't worth filing a claim because I just sanded and painted over the marks. However, I was glad I had that option, and I informed Karen through a mutual neighbor that I would involve my insurance provider and the legal system if my property was damaged again. That may have caused her to withdraw abruptly. This saga ended a few weeks later when the city finished investigating Karen's false police calls. She was fined for misusing emergency services, according to my sources. With the parking tickets, property damage citation, potential HOA lien, and fines, Karen must have been financially burdened. A neighbor told me Karen was complaining that she couldn't afford a vacation that year due to unexpected expenses, probably the price of her arrogance. I sometimes think about how strange it was. None of my neighbors in other places tried anything so crazy. However, I'm oddly grateful it happened early in my tenure. I strengthened relationships with other residents. People realized I wasn't a doormat or a standoffish newcomer. Several neighbors congratulated me on surviving the ultimate test. We joked about Karen's parking war when asked about strange neighborhood stories. I've since upgraded my garage with better shelving, a workbench, and lighting. I sometimes tell friends the short version of the garage story, which makes them laugh or stand there slack-jawed, trying to figure out how anyone could think they owned someone else's locked garage. I still find it surreal, but the repainted crowbar marks showed how far some people will go when they refuse to accept no. Finally, I'm relieved the situation is mostly over. Without forced intrusions or nuisance calls, I can appreciate my home. Karen may not like me, but let her. I think we can be distant neighbors if she respects the line she crossed. If she pulls another stunt, I know what to do. Stay calm, document everything, and let the legal system work. Karen learned the hard way that entitlement can backfire on aggressive users. I'm glad I stood my ground and protected my privacy, peace of mind, and right to say no. Friends, thank you. See you soon.